The morning inspection at Fort Davidson would change everything. Staff Sergeant Jessica Parker stood in perfect formation, her uniform crisp, her posture flawless, waiting for General William Carter to acknowledge her salute. But when the moment came, his eyes passed right through her as if she didn't exist. What the general didn't know was that beneath her sleeve lay a tattoo that would shatter everything he thought he understood about the soldier standing before him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Fort Davidson sprawled across the Nevada desert like a concrete monument to military discipline, its buildings baking under the relentless sun that turned asphalt into mirrors and made every breath feel like swallowing fire. The base housed 12,000 personnel, but for Staff Sergeant Jessica Parker, it might as well have been a ghost town where she was the only living soul nobody could see. At 0530 hours, reveille echoed across the barracks complex, the same mechanical wake-up call that had punctured her sleep for the past 18 months. Jessica's eyes opened immediately, no grogginess, no gradual awakening, just the instant alertness of someone whose survival had once depended on being ready for anything at any moment. She dressed with the same precision she'd maintained since arriving at Davidson, every crease perfect, every button aligned, every detail regulation perfect, despite knowing that nobody would notice or care. The mess hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of morning routine, metal trays clattering against serving counters, boots scuffing against linoleum floors, hundreds of conversations blending into white noise. Jessica moved through the breakfast line like a phantom, invisible to the soldiers around her. Sergeant First Class Brandon Murphy stood 3 people ahead, regaling his audience with another story about weekend conquests and training victories. So, there I was, 30-foot rappel, middle of a thunderstorm. Murphy's voice carried across the serving area, while some people were probably hiding in supply closets, doing paperwork. His eyes found Jessica in line, and his smirk carried just enough malice to make his meaning clear. Takes real soldiers to handle real missions, you know what I mean? The soldiers around Murphy chuckled, not because the joke was particularly clever, but because laughing felt safer than questioning. Jessica kept her expression neutral, accepting scrambled eggs and toast from Sergeant Melissa Wright, who avoided eye contact like Jessica carried some contagious disease. She'd learned months ago that responding to Murphy's provocations only gave him more ammunition, and silence had become her most reliable defense. Private Ashley Foster sat alone at a corner table, the only soldier who ever made room for Jessica without being asked. At 19, Foster still carried the wide-eyed optimism that basic training hadn't completely crushed, though her admiration for Jessica puzzled everyone who knew about Parker's supposed failures. "Morning, Sergeant," Foster said quietly as Jessica sat down. "Sleep okay?" "Fine, Private. You?" Jessica's response was automatic, professional, revealing nothing of the nightmares that still visited her sleep, not from combat, but from the slow suffocation of being erased from existence while still breathing. Colonel Richard Stone's voice boomed across the mess hall before Foster could respond. "Listen up, people. We've got a surprise inspection coming our way. General William Carter will be conducting a full base review starting at 0800. I want every uniform perfect, every area spotless, every soldier representing the finest traditions of this installation." The mess hall erupted in groans and frantic conversations as soldiers calculated how much time they had to prepare. Jessica finished her breakfast without changing pace. Her gear was always inspection ready, her living space always regulation perfect. She'd learned long ago that excellence was the only armor that sometimes worked, though even that had proven insufficient against the institutional blindness that had infected Fort Davidson. Walking to her duty station in the supply depot, Jessica passed groups of soldiers frantically polishing boots and adjusting uniforms. Lieutenant Christopher Lee supervised a squad of privates organizing equipment, his young face tight with the anxiety of an officer who knew his career could hinge on moments like these. He was 24, fresh from officer candidate school, still believing that hard work and good intentions guaranteed success in the military. "Parker," he called as she passed, "make sure the supply manifest is ready for review. Everything needs to be accounted for." "Already complete, sir," Jessica replied, snapping a crisp salute that Lee returned absently, his attention already shifting to the next crisis demanding his focus. The supply depot had become Jessica's domain by default. Nobody else wanted the tedious work of inventory management and requisition processing. She'd transformed the chaotic storage facility into a model of organization, every item cataloged, every transaction documented, every procedure followed to the letter. It was meaningful work disguised as punishment, useful contribution hidden behind institutional neglect. Corporal Rachel Turner arrived 20 minutes late, as had become her habit since learning that Jessica wouldn't report punctuality issues. Turner was competent enough when she applied herself, but she'd absorbed the general attitude toward Jessica and saw no reason to maintain military standards when working with someone the base had written off as deadweight. "Big inspection today," Turner said, settling into her desk without urgency. "Guess we better look busy when the general comes through." Jessica continued her morning inventory check, noting discrepancies in ammunition counts that would need investigation. "We should verify the small arms requisitions from last week. The numbers don't match the delivery receipts." "Does it matter?" Turner asked, pulling out her phone. "Nobody expects miracles from supply depot assignments." The casual dismissal stung more than intended insults. Turner wasn't malicious, just indifferent, treating Jessica's suggestions with the same disregard that had infected the entire base. Jessica had stopped trying to explain that attention to detail mattered, that small errors in supply management could have life or death consequences downrange. Nobody wanted to hear about consequences from someone they'd categorized as incompetent. At 7:45, word spread through the depot that General Carter's inspection team had arrived. Through the window, Jessica watched black SUVs pull up to the headquarters building, disgorging officers whose uniforms looked like they'd been pressed by machines that cost more than most soldiers made in a year. General Carter emerged from the lead vehicle, a man whose presence commanded attention without effort, whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Carter was a soldier's general, someone who'd earned respect through decades of service in conflicts that had shaped modern military doctrine. His inspection tours were legendary for their thoroughness and unpredictability. He had a talent for finding the problems that careful preparation tried to hide, the systemic issues that polished surfaces couldn't disguise. Master Sergeant Anthony Clark appeared in the supply depot doorway, his face flushed from running between locations. "General's team will be here in 10 minutes, he announced. "I want everything perfect. Parker, your background for this. Stay quiet. Stay out of the way. Let Turner handle any questions." The instructions shouldn't have surprised Jessica, but it still felt like a physical blow. She'd spent months perfecting the depot's operations, solving problems that had plagued previous administrators, turning supply management into a precision operation that other bases used as a model. But when it came time for recognition or responsibility, she became invisible again, pushed into shadows while others took credit for her work. Turner straightened her uniform and practiced answers to questions. She might be asked about procedures she barely understood. Clark checked his watch nervously, adjusting papers on Turner's desk to create an impression of busy competence. Jessica remained at her inventory station, continuing work that actually mattered while preparing to be ignored by the people who should have valued her contributions most. Outside, the inspection team moved closer, General Carter's voice carrying across the compound as he questioned soldiers and examined facilities. Jessica could hear the professional confidence in his tone, the authority of someone accustomed to getting straight answers to direct questions. Soon he would enter her workspace, look past her as if she were furniture, and leave without ever. Knowing that the supply depot's excellence was built on foundations he would never see. The irony wasn't lost on her. A general who'd built his reputation on recognizing talent and rewarding merit was about to walk past one of his most capable soldiers without acknowledgement, another casualty of institutional blindness that turned competence into invisibility and reduced decorated veterans to administrative afterthoughts. But Jessica had learned patience in places where impatience meant death, endurance in situations where quitting wasn't an option. She would stand at attention when General Carter entered, salute with the precision that military tradition demanded, and accept his indifference with the same professional bearing she'd maintained through 18 months of systematic dismissal. What she didn't know was that beneath her carefully pressed sleeve, a tattoo weighted black ink carrying secrets that would change everything the moment the right person recognized its meaning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. General William Carter moved through Fort Davidson with the measured pace of someone who understood that real inspection required patience. Unlike the rushed reviews that most officers conducted, Carter believed that truth revealed itself in quiet moments, in the spaces between official presentations where soldiers thought nobody important was watching. His entourage followed at a respectful distance. Colonel Stone, Major Susan Bailey, and Lieutenant Colonel James Cooper from the Pentagon, each carrying clipboards thick with evaluation criteria and performance metrics. But Carter had learned decades ago that the most important intelligence couldn't be quantified on forms. It lived in the way soldiers carried themselves when they thought the inspection team had moved on, in the efficiency of operations that nobody bothered to highlight, in the small details that revealed institutional character. The motor pool had been his first stop, where he discovered maintenance records so precise they could have been used as textbook examples. The sergeant in charge, clearly nervous about the unexpected attention, had stammered through explanations of procedures that were obviously second nature. Carter made notes, not about the mechanical processes, but about the confidence gap between competence and recognition. Next came the training facilities, where he observed exercises that flowed with choreographed precision. The soldiers performed admirably, but their movements carried the rehearsed quality of people who'd been practicing for weeks. Carter understood the necessity of preparation, but he preferred observing routine operations where true capability emerged naturally. The mess hall review had provided unexpected insights. Sergeant Melissa Wright managed food service operations with military efficiency, but Carter noticed how certain soldiers received subtly different treatment, smaller portions, less attention, the kind of discrimination that happened below the threshold of official policy, but above the line of basic respect. He filed these observations mentally, patterns that would become important later. Private Nathan Phillips had been particularly eager to share gossip during the informal questioning period. "Sir, if you want to know about real soldiers, you should talk to Sergeant First Class Murphy. Guy's got more combat experience than anyone on base. Knows how to handle the tough assignments." Carter listened without commitment, recognizing the type of soldier who mistook volume for competence, who needed to diminish others to feel significant. Phillips continued volunteering information nobody had requested, painting pictures of base dynamics that revealed more about the speaker than his subjects. "There's some soldiers here who just don't measure up, you know. Taking up space that real operators could use better." Phillips' eyes had darted toward a corner table where two soldiers sat in quiet conversation. "Like Parker over there. Word is she's got issues with pressure situations. Probably better off in supply work than anywhere important." The comment lodged in Carter's memory, not because he believed it, but because it demonstrated the casual Cruelty that infected military culture when leadership failed to maintain standards of respect. He'd seen talented soldiers destroyed by whisper campaigns, careers ended by rumors that took on lives of their own. Now, approaching the supply depot, Carter felt the familiar anticipation that came with discovering overlooked excellence. The facility's exterior showed signs of meticulous maintenance, fresh paint, organized storage areas, equipment properly secured according to regulations that many bases ignored. Someone here understood that attention to detail mattered, regardless of whether anyone noticed. Master Sergeant Clark intercepted the inspection team at the depot entrance, his anxiety barely concealed beneath professional courtesy. "General Carter, sir, welcome to our Supply Operations Center. I think you'll find everything in excellent order." Carter acknowledged the greeting while observing the facility's layout. Storage areas were labeled with military precision, inventory. Systems showed signs of recent reorganization, and work areas maintained the kind of cleanliness that spoke to systematic rather than cosmetic attention. This wasn't preparation for inspection. This was consistent operational excellence. "Who's responsible for the depot management?" Carter asked, noting Clark's momentary hesitation before answering. "Corporal Turner has been doing excellent work, sir. Really transformed our processes over the past year." Clark's voice carried conviction, but his eyes avoided direct contact, suggesting complexity beneath the simple answer. Inside the depot, Carter immediately noticed the contrast between presentation and reality. Turner sat at the primary desk, clearly designated as the person responsible for answering questions, but her workspace showed signs of recent organization that didn't match the systematic efficiency visible throughout the rest of the facility. Meanwhile, at a corner workstation, another soldier continued inventory work with the focused intensity of someone for whom precision was routine rather than performance. Carter approached Turner first, following protocol and Clark's introduction. "Corporal Turner, walk me through your inventory management system." Turner's explanation was competent, but shallow. Describing procedures she obviously understood in general terms, without demonstrating the deep familiarity that came from daily implementation. She answered questions correctly, but without the confidence that came from genuine expertise. Carter recognized the pattern. Someone briefed on operations she supervised rather than conducted. These efficiency improvements. Carter continued, "When did you implement the new cataloging system?" Turner's pause lasted a beat too long. "About 6 months ago, sir. We identified some inefficiencies in the old procedures and developed better solutions." Carter nodded noncommittally while observing the soldier at the corner workstation. Her movements showed the unconscious efficiency of someone who knew exactly where every item belonged, whose muscle memory had been shaped by countless repetitions of the same precise procedures. She worked without reference to charts or manuals, navigating the inventory system with the fluidity that came only from personal design. Implementation. Lieutenant Lee appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from hurrying between inspection points. "General Carter, sir. Everything meeting your expectations? Tell me about your supply staff, Lieutenant. How do you evaluate performance in this area?" Lee glanced around the depot, his attention settling on Turner as the obvious focus of the question. "Corporal Turner has done exceptional work reorganizing our systems, sir. We've had 0 discrepancies in our last 3 audits, improved response times for requisitions by 40%, and established procedures that other bases have requested to study." Carter processed this information while continuing to observe the corner workstation where the other soldier maintained her focused work. Something about her concentration suggested capabilities that extended beyond basic supply management. Her posture carried the alertness of someone trained for situations more demanding than inventory control. Her movements efficient in ways that spoke to training beyond standard military logistics. "And your other staff member?" Carter asked, nodding toward Jessica's workstation. Clark stepped forward quickly. Staff Sergeant Parker handles basic inventory duties, sir. Support functions, nothing requiring special attention. Asterisk. The dismissal in Clark's voice triggered Carter's investigative instincts. In 40 years of military service, he'd learned that the soldiers most quickly dismissed often carried the most interesting stories. Excellence hidden by institutional blindness was a phenomenon he'd encountered repeatedly, usually in circumstances where politics mattered more than performance. Carter walked toward Jessica's workstation, noting how conversation in the depot ceased as his attention shifted. She stood immediately, her movement crisp and automatic, the response of someone whose military bearing had been shaped by experiences that demanded precision under pressure. "Staff Sergeant Parker," Carter said, reading her name tape. "Show me what you're working on." Jessica's explanation of the inventory discrepancies was comprehensive and detailed, revealing familiarity with supply chain management that extended far beyond basic logistics. She identified patterns in requisition data that suggested potential issues with upstream suppliers, recommended solutions that demonstrated strategic thinking, and discussed operational implications with the expertise of someone who understood how supply failures affected mission readiness. Carter found himself impressed not just by her competence, but by the systematic approach she developed for problems that other soldiers would have handled with standard procedures. This was innovative thinking applied to mundane tasks, excellence emerging in circumstances where nobody expected or rewarded it. These efficiency improvements, Carter said, gesturing toward the reorganized storage systems. "You developed these procedures?" Jessica's glance toward Turner and Clark was brief but revealing. "I contributed to the process, sir." The diplomatic answer spoke volumes about base dynamics Carter was beginning to understand. Jessica had clearly designed and implemented the systems that had earned Turner recognition, but claiming credit would have created problems that weren't worth the temporary satisfaction of acknowledgement. As Carter prepared to move on to the next inspection point, he noticed Jessica rolling up her sleeve to check her watch. The movement was casual, automatic, but it exposed a section of her forearm that made Carter pause. Black ink formed geometric patterns, partially visible beneath the fabric, not the typical military tattoos he'd seen thousands of times, but something more specific, more purposeful. The design was familiar in a way that made his pulse quicken. Carter had seen similar markings in classified briefings, in secure facilities where even generals needed special clearance to enter. The pattern suggested affiliations with operations so sensitive they existed only in whispered conversations, and locked file cabinets. But before he could get a closer look, Jessica had adjusted her sleeve and returned to attention, the tattoo hidden once again beneath regulation fabric. Carter found himself staring at a soldier whose competence had been overlooked, whose capabilities had been dismissed, and who might be carrying secrets that changed everything about her presence at Fort Davidson. The inspection continued, but Carter's attention remained divided. As his team moved toward the next facility, he found himself looking back at the supply depot, wondering what other truths were hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the right knowledge to recognize their significance. The geometric patterns haunted Carter's thoughts as his inspection team moved through the base communication center. Lieutenant Colonel Cooper was explaining fiber optic upgrades and digital security protocols, but Carter's attention kept drifting back to that brief glimpse of ink beneath Jessica's sleeve. The design wasn't random, it carried the precision of official insignia, the purposeful arrangement of symbols that meant something specific to people with the right security clearance. Specialist Ryan Howard demonstrated the communications array with obvious pride, his technical expertise impressive for someone barely 2 years out of training. "Sir, we've upgraded to quantum encrypted channels for all classified communications. Zero intercept capability, even from state-level actors." Carter nodded appropriately while his mind processed possibilities. Black operations use specific identification markers, tattoos that served as recognition codes for personnel whose identities had been sanitized from official records. The practice was rare, reserved for the most sensitive operations where traditional identification methods created security vulnerabilities. Dr. Victoria Ross intercepted the inspection team outside the medical facility, her civilian clothes and Pentagon credentials marking her as someone whose presence at Fort Davidson required explanation. "General Carter, I've been waiting to discuss some psychological evaluation protocols with you." Ross was a specialist in post-traumatic stress disorders related to classified operations, her security clearance higher than most military officers. Her research focused on soldiers whose psychological injuries couldn't be treated through conventional therapy because the traumatic events couldn't be discussed without violating national security protocols. "Doctor, are you conducting evaluations here?" Carter asked, noting how her eyes tracked toward the supply depot they'd recently left. "Ongoing research, sir. I'm particularly interested in soldiers who've experienced institutional isolation after classified service. The psychological impact can be devastating when someone's actual achievements can't be acknowledged or discussed." The conversation took on new significance as Carter connected possibilities. Soldiers from black operations often faced reintegration challenges when their classified service ended. Their records showed gaps, their skills seemed inconsistent with their official assignments, and their psychological responses to civilian treatment made little sense without context that couldn't be provided. Major Bailey approached with a tablet full of inspection notes. "Sir, we're ahead of schedule. Would you like to review the vehicle maintenance logs next, or would you prefer to complete the administrative review?" Carter checked his watch, calculating time remaining before the formal debrief session with base leadership. "Major, pull the personnel files for the supply depot staff. I want to review their service records before we conclude today's activities." The request surprised Bailey, who'd expected focus on more prominent facilities, but she nodded efficiently and began making calls to arrange the file access. Carter's reputation for thoroughness was legendary, but requesting detailed personnel reviews for supply staff seemed unusually specific. In the base conference room, Carter reviewed the requested files while his team compiled their preliminary assessment. Corporal Turner's record was straightforward, solid performance, steady progression, no unusual assignments or gaps in service history. Her file read like a textbook example of competent military progression without extraordinary achievements or failures. Jessica Parker's file told a different story entirely. Her service record showed periods of assignment to units that didn't officially exist, training certifications for skills that weren't explained, and commendations for achievements that weren't described. Most telling were the gaps, months of service time that appeared in her length of service calculations, but weren't documented in the record itself. Carter had seen similar files before, always for soldiers whose actual service required classification beyond normal military security protocols. The pattern was unmistakable: sanitized records designed to provide plausible cover for capabilities that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Jessica's file practically screamed classified operations background to anyone who knew how to read. Between the lines, Lieutenant Lee knocked on the conference room door, carrying additional documentation that Bailey had requested. "Sir, you asked for supplemental training records. Most are standard, but Staff Sergeant Parker has some interesting certifications." The training documents revealed specialized skills that made no sense for a soldier assigned to supply depot management. Advanced tactical medicine, multiple language certifications, survival training typically reserved for special operations personnel, and weapons qualifications far beyond standard military requirements. Either Jessica was the most overtrained supply clerk in military history, or her current assignment bore no relationship to her actual capabilities. Dr. Ross appeared in the conference room doorway. "General, might I have a word about one of the soldiers you met today?" Carter gestured her inside, noting how she carefully closed the door behind her. Her manner suggested conversation that required privacy, information that shouldn't be overheard by personnel without appropriate clearance. "Staff Sergeant Parker," Ross began without preamble. "I've been monitoring her case for the past year. Her psychological profile shows classic symptoms of institutional betrayal trauma, the specific stress response that occurs when organizations fail to protect people who've sacrificed to protect the organization." "You're familiar with her background?" Carter asked, suspecting that Ross knew more about Jessica's history than the sanitized personnel file revealed. "I know that she served in operations that can't be discussed, achieved things that can't be acknowledged, and sacrificed in ways that can't be publicly recognized. I also know that the military's failure to protect her post-service identity has created psychological damage that conventional therapy can't address." Ross pulled out a tablet, showing psychological evaluation charts. "Look at these stress indicators. This isn't combat-related PTSD, it's the specific trauma pattern we see in soldiers whose classified service has been weaponized against them by people who don't understand what they're actually attacking." Carter studied the charts, recognizing patterns he'd seen in soldiers whose black operations service had ended badly. The psychological signature was distinctive: high-performance capability combined with institutional isolation, competence undermined by systematic dismissal, identity, erosion caused by forced denial of actual achievements. "Doctor, what would proper recognition do for her psychological state?" Asterisk, it would validate her sense of reality, restore her professional identity, and demonstrate that her sacrifices weren't meaningless. But more importantly, it would show other classified service veterans that the institution eventually honors its commitments to people who serve in shadows. The conversation was interrupted by commotion outside the conference room. Through the window, Carter could see soldiers gathering near the supply depot, their body language suggesting some kind of incident was developing. Lieutenant Lee appeared at the door, his face tight with concern. "Sir, there's a situation developing. Some soldiers are confronting Staff Sergeant Parker about her work performance. It's getting heated." Carter moved quickly toward the depot, Dr. Ross and Major Bailey following close behind. Outside the facility, Sergeant First Class Murphy had cornered Jessica near the loading dock, surrounded by soldiers whose afternoon boredom had turned into entertainment at someone else's expense. "Come on, Parker," Murphy's voice carried across the compound. "Show us those supply management skills you're so famous for. Maybe demonstrate how you handle pressure situations without freezing up." Jessica stood at attention, her face expressionless. Despite the growing crowd of spectators, someone had obviously spread word about the general's interest in the supply depot, and Murphy had decided to capitalize on the attention by reinforcing base opinion about Jessica's supposed incompetence. "Private." Phillips pushed forward with his phone recording. "Yeah, let's see some of that tactical brilliance we keep hearing doesn't exist." The crowd's laughter had an ugly edge, the sound of people relieving their own insecurities by attacking someone they perceived as weaker. Jessica remained silent, professional, refusing to be provoked into responses that would only provide more ammunition for future harassment. Carter approached the scene with growing anger. Military discipline existed to prevent exactly this kind of organized cruelty, but leadership failure had allowed a culture where competent soldiers could be systematically abused for entertainment. The situation violated every principle he'd spent 40 years defending. "Attention." Carter's command voice cut through the crowd noise like artillery fire. "What exactly is happening here?" The soldiers scattered immediately, recognizing trouble when they saw it. Murphy attempted to salvage the situation with an explanation that made him look even worse. "Sir, just some friendly training discussion. Nothing serious." Carter's expression could have frozen desert sand. "Sergeant First Class Murphy, I want to see you in the conference room immediately. The rest of you, Return to your duties and reflect on whether your behavior represents the military values we're supposed to uphold." As the crowd dispersed, Carter found himself alone with Jessica near the depot entrance. She maintained her professional bearing, but he could see the cost of enduring constant humiliation in the tension around her eyes, the careful control that suggested years of practice managing institutional cruelty. "Staff Sergeant Parker," Carter said quietly, "I believe we have something important to discuss." Jessica looked directly at him for the first time, her eyes carrying intelligence and determination that had somehow survived 18 months of systematic attempts to break her spirit. "Sir?" Carter glanced around to ensure privacy, then spoke words that would change everything. "I think it's time I saw that tattoo properly." The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibilities that neither of them fully understood yet. Jessica's hand moved instinctively toward her sleeve, then stopped as she processed the implications of the general's request. Recognition was coming, but it carried risks along with redemption. Everything would change once that sleeve was rolled up and the truth became visible. There would be no going back to institutional invisibility, no return to the safety of being overlooked. But perhaps, after 18 months in the wilderness, it was finally time to come home. The supply depot office felt smaller with General Carter's presence filling the space. Jessica had closed the door at his request, the first private conversation she'd had with a senior officer since arriving at Fort Davidson 18 months earlier. Outside, the base continued its afternoon routine, unaware that everything was about to change inside this unremarkable administrative building. Carter positioned himself where he could see both Jessica and the door, his 40 years of military service having taught him to control the environment during sensitive discussions. "Staff Sergeant Parker, before we proceed, I need you to understand that this conversation is strictly off the record until I determine otherwise." Jessica nodded, her military bearing perfect despite the uncertainty in her eyes. She'd been through enough classified briefings to recognize the tone of voice that preceded revelations requiring security protocols. Whatever was about to happen, it involved information that couldn't be casually shared. "I've been reviewing your service record," Carter continued, "and I've noticed some interesting gaps. Training certifications that don't match your current assignment, time periods that aren't adequately explained, commendations for achievements that aren't described in detail." Carter paused, watching Jessica's reaction carefully. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but he caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested recognition of where this conversation was heading. "These gaps usually indicate one of two things," Carter said. "Either there are significant problems with military record keeping, or someone's actual service has been classified at levels that require sanitized documentation." Jessica's silence spoke volumes. A soldier with nothing to hide would have asked questions, requested clarification, or expressed confusion about the general's observations. Her quiet attention suggested someone who understood exactly what classified service gaps looked like in official documentation. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, Staff Sergeant, and I need a direct answer. Have you served in operations that were classified above standard military security protocols?" The moment stretched between them, loaded with implications that could reshape everything about Jessica's future. She could continue maintaining the cover story that had protected classified operations but destroyed her professional reputation. Or she could trust that recognition had finally arrived from someone with authority to act on the truth. "Sir," Jessica said carefully, "there are aspects of my service history that I'm not authorized to discuss without proper clearance verification." Carter nodded, recognizing the precise language that classified personnel used when they couldn't confirm or deny their actual service. It was as close to an admission as she could provide without violating security protocols that carried criminal penalties. "I understand the constraints you're operating under," Carter replied. "But I need to see that tattoo now." Full visibility, no partial glimpses. Jessica hesitated for one final moment, then slowly rolled up her sleeve. The geometric patterns emerged from beneath the fabric like a secret map being revealed, black ink forming symbols that carried meaning far beyond their artistic value. The design was intricate, purposeful, clearly military in origin, but unlike anything used by conventional forces. Carter's breath caught as the full tattoo became visible. The symbols were unmistakable to anyone who'd seen them in the right classified briefings, operational markers used by Task Force Phantom, one of the military's most secretive special operations units. The geometric patterns weren't random decoration. They were recognition codes that identified personnel whose very existence was classified at the highest levels. "Task Force Phantom," Carter said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of recognition and respect that Jessica hadn't heard in 18 months. Her composure cracked slightly at hearing those words spoken aloud by someone who understood their significance. For nearly 2 years, she'd carried the weight of service that couldn't be acknowledged, achievements that couldn't be discussed, sacrifices that couldn't be recognized. Now finally, someone with authority knew the truth. Operation Nightfall. Carter continued, pieces falling into place as he connected Jessica's tattoo to classified operations he'd been briefed on at the highest levels. Somalia 3 years ago. The hostage extraction that prevented international incident. Jessica's eyes widened slightly. Operation Nightfall was so classified that fewer than 50 people in the entire military knew its details. The fact that Carter could reference it specifically meant his security clearance extended into areas where even generals needed special authorization. "You were part of the extraction team," Carter said, not asking but confirming what the tattoo had already told him. 6 operators went in to extract 2 American journalists being held by terrorist forces. Intelligence suggested they were about to be executed on international television. Carter moved closer, studying the tattoo's details with the attention of someone who understood their significance. The operation was supposed to be surgical: get in, extract the hostages, get out without engagement. But intelligence was wrong, wasn't it? Jessica found her voice, speaking words she hadn't been able to say to anyone for 3 years. The compound was heavily fortified. 50 hostiles instead of the 15 we'd been briefed to expect. Automatic weapons emplacements. Rocket-propelled grenades. It was a fortress disguised as a safe house. Carter nodded grimly. He'd read the classified after-action reports, but hearing first-hand account from someone who'd been on the ground carried different weight entirely. "The mission should have been aborted," Jessica continued, years of suppressed truth finally finding voice. Any reasonable commander would have pulled back, called for air support, waited for better intelligence. But the journalists had 12 hours before their execution was going to be broadcast worldwide. "So you went in anyway," Carter said, understanding the impossible choice that had faced the Task Force Phantom team that night in Somalia. Team leader Captain Daniel Reed made the call. "We had 2 choices: abort the mission and watch American civilians die on international television, or attempt extraction against overwhelming odds with no backup support." Carter recognized Reed's name from the most classified personnel files. Reed was legendary within special operations circles, a leader who'd accomplished missions that officially never happened, whose success rate on impossible operations was unmatched by anyone in modern military history. "The extraction took 4 hours, Jessica said, her voice carrying the weight of memories that had shaped every day since. "We fought through defensive positions that should have been insurmountable, sustained casualties that should have ended. The mission overcame obstacles that existed specifically to prevent exactly what we were attempting." Carter waited for her to continue, recognizing that some stories required time to emerge after years of enforced silence. Private Martinez was killed in the first assault. Sergeant Williams took shrapnel that should have been fatal, but kept fighting for 2 hours. I carried one journalist while Reed carried the other, fighting retreat through hostile territory while the compound burned behind us. The mission was successful, Carter said, remembering the classified brief that had described Operation Nightfall as textbook special operations execution. We got both journalists out alive. The video of their execution never aired. International incident was prevented. Terrorist cell was eliminated. Mission accomplished. Jessica's voice carried bitter irony, except that none of it could ever be publicly acknowledged. Carter understood the cruel mathematics of classified operations. Success that couldn't be recognized, heroism that couldn't be celebrated, sacrifice that couldn't be honored because admitting the mission had occurred would create diplomatic problems for multiple governments. After nightfall, Task Force Phantom was disbanded, Jessica continued. Cover identities were created for surviving personnel. Our actual service records were classified beyond recognition. We were reassigned to conventional units with manufactured histories that explained our presence without revealing our capabilities. And you were sent here, Carter said, beginning to understand the institutional failure that had allowed a decorated special operations veteran to be treated like an incompetent supply clerk. The cover story was that I'd failed under pressure during a routine deployment, made tactical errors that endangered my unit. Enough truth to be believable, enough lies to explain why someone with my supposed experience was being assigned to administrative duties. Carter felt anger building as he understood how completely the system had failed Jessica. Her manufactured disciplinary record had become the basis for 18 months of systematic humiliation by people who had no idea. They were attacking a soldier whose courage under fire exceeded anything they'd ever experienced. But the cover story took on its own life, Jessica said quietly. Officers who should have known it was fabricated accepted it as truth. Soldiers who should have recognized competence saw only official disapproval. I became the cautionary tale about what happened when soldiers couldn't handle real pressure. While your actual service record was locked away in files that required presidential authorization to access, Carter said, understanding the complete picture now. Jessica rolled down her sleeve, hiding the tattoo that had just changed everything. Sir, I've served with honor in operations that prevented international crises, saved civilian lives, and eliminated threats to national security. But I've also spent 18 months being treated like a failure by an institution that should have protected my cover identity instead of using it to justify abuse. Carter stood silently for several moments, processing the implications of everything he'd learned. Outside the depot office, Fort Davidson continued its routine operations, unaware that one of its most accomplished soldiers had just revealed service history that would reshape everything about how she was perceived and treated. Finally, Carter spoke. Staff Sergeant Parker, you have my word that this situation is going to change immediately. No one who served at your level should endure what you've experienced here. Jessica looked directly at him, hope and skepticism warring in her expression. She'd learned not to trust promises from senior officers, but something in Carter's voice suggested this time might be different. What happens next, sir? Carter moved toward the office door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Next, we remind this base what it means to honor the soldiers who serve in shadows to protect the rest of us. The base conference room had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. General Carter sat at the head of the polished table, flanked by Lieutenant Colonel Cooper and Dr. Ross, while Colonel Stone shifted uncomfortably in his chair across from them. Major Bailey's laptop displayed personnel files and classified documents that had required special authorization to access, each page telling a story that contradicted 18 months of institutional narrative. Colonel Stone, Carter began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. I need you to explain how a decorated Task Force Phantom operative ended up being treated like a disciplinary problem at your installation. Stone's face had gone pale when Carter mentioned Task Force Phantom. Like most senior officers, he'd heard whispers about the unit's existence, but had never been cleared to know operational details. The revelation that one of his soldiers had served at that level while being systematically abused under his command was a career-ending nightmare coming to life. "Sir, I was never briefed on Staff Sergeant Parker's actual background," Stone said, his voice strained. Her personnel file indicated disciplinary issues from her previous assignment. Standard protocol would be to monitor her performance and provide appropriate supervision. *Standard protocol, Carter repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air, like an accusation. "Colonel, what does standard protocol say about allowing systematic harassment of soldiers under your command?" Dr. Ross leaned forward, her tablet displaying psychological evaluation data. "General, I've documented 18 months of institutional abuse targeting Staff Sergeant Parker. Harassment during training exercises, social isolation during meal periods, public humiliation during routine duties. This goes far beyond normal military discipline." Lieutenant Colonel Cooper cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, if I may, the cover story in Parker's file was designed to be convincing. Without proper clearance, it would be reasonable for base personnel to accept the documented disciplinary history as accurate." Carter's expression could have melted steel. "Cooper, there's a difference between accepting the cover story and weaponizing it for entertainment. What I witnessed today wasn't professional supervision, it was organized cruelty." The door opened to admit Master Sergeant Clark, who entered with the rigid posture of someone expecting the worst possible news. Carter had summoned him after the depot incident, and Clark's anxiety was visible in every line of his body. "Master Sergeant Clark," Carter said without preamble, "explain to me how you justified allowing your soldiers to record harassment videos of Staff Sergeant Parker for social media entertainment." Clark's mouth opened and closed silently. He hadn't known about the recording until Private Phillips had mentioned it during questioning, but ignorance felt inadequate as a defense when faced with Carter's scrutiny. "Sir, I was unaware that any recording was taking place," Clark finally managed. "If I had known, you would have what?" Carter interrupted. "Stopped it? The same way you stopped the systematic exclusion from training exercises? The same way you prevented the public humiliation during equipment inspections?" Dr. Ross consulted her notes. "Master Sergeant, I've interviewed multiple soldiers who describe a pattern of harassment that occurred with your knowledge and tacit approval. Creating hostile work environments for personnel under disciplinary review violates multiple military regulations." Clark looked desperately toward Colonel Stone for support, but found none. Stone was dealing with his own crisis as he realized how completely his leadership had failed someone whose actual service record made his own accomplishments look modest by comparison. "The harassment stops immediately," Carter announced, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "Every soldier who participated in the systematic abuse of Staff Sergeant Parker will face appropriate disciplinary action. Every officer who allowed it to continue will answer for their failure to maintain professional standards." Lieutenant Lee knocked and entered, carrying additional documentation that Major Bailey had requested. His young face showed the strain of someone learning that everything he'd believed about military justice was more complicated than his training had suggested. "Sir," Lee said quietly, "you requested the complete incident reports for the past year. There are 17 documented cases of harassment targeting Staff Sergeant Parker. Most were classified as minor disciplinary infractions rather than systematic abuse." Carter reviewed the reports with growing disgust. Each incident had been minimized, isolated, treated as individual problems rather than components of institutional failure. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to look, but leadership had chosen comfortable blindness over difficult accountability. "Lieutenant Lee," Carter said, noting how the young officer maintained professional bearing despite obvious distress, "you witnessed the harassment but didn't intervene. Explain your reasoning." Lee's answer came with painful honesty. Sir, I believe the disciplinary record indicated that Staff Sergeant Parker had performance issues that required correction. I thought allowing peer pressure might motivate improvement. You thought organized. Humiliation was appropriate motivation for a soldier whose actual service record includes missions that prevented international incidents. The question hung in the air like an indictment of institutional culture that prioritized convenient assumptions over difficult investigation. Lee had no answer because there was no acceptable answer. Dr. Ross addressed the broader implications. General, what we're seeing here is a classic example of how classified service creates vulnerability to institutional abuse. Soldiers whose achievements can't be acknowledged become targets for people who mistake secrecy for failure. Carter stood and walked to the conference room window, looking out at Fort Davidson's afternoon activities. Somewhere on this base, soldiers were performing their duties with the same competence that Jessica had demonstrated in the supply depot, unaware that their general had just learned lessons about leadership failure that would reshape how the installation operated. Gentlemen, Carter said without turning around, we have a problem that extends beyond individual personnel issues. This base has developed a culture where competence is dismissed, excellence is ignored, and systematic abuse is tolerated as long as it targets someone whose actual capabilities are classified. He turned back to face the room. That culture ends today. Major Bailey looked up from her laptop. Sir, what are your specific instructions regarding Staff Sergeant Parker's situation? First, her actual service record will be declassified to the extent necessary to demonstrate her qualifications and achievements. Second, every officer and NCO on this base will receive mandatory training on recognizing and preventing harassment of personnel under disciplinary review. Third, we're implementing immediate oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again. Colonel Stone found his voice, though it carried little authority. Sir, declassifying portions of her record could create security complications. Colonel, Carter interrupted. Security complications are manageable. What's not manageable is allowing decorated veterans to be systematically abused because their service can't be publicly acknowledged. We'll find ways to recognize excellence without compromising operational security. Dr. Ross closed her tablet with obvious satisfaction. General, this decision could have implications far beyond Fort Davidson. There are hundreds of veterans from classified operations facing similar institutional blindness at bases worldwide. Carter nodded grimly. Doctor, that's exactly why this matters. If we can't protect soldiers whose service requires classification, we're failing the people who've sacrificed the most to protect national security. The meeting continued for another hour, establishing protocols and procedures designed to prevent future Jessica Parkers from enduring systematic abuse while their actual achievements remained hidden. But as Carter listened to discussions about policy implementation and training requirements, his thoughts kept returning to the soldier who'd stood silently in that supply depot, enduring 18 months of humiliation while carrying secrets that would humble everyone who'd participated in her abuse. Outside the conference room, word was spreading through Fort Davidson's informal communication networks. The afternoon harassment incident had ended with unprecedented disciplinary action. Soldiers were being questioned about their treatment of Staff Sergeant Parker, and rumors suggested that her background was far more significant than anyone had realized. Sergeant First Class Murphy sat in the base holding cell, his afternoon entertainment having transformed into career-ending consequences faster than he'd thought possible. The recording that Private Phillips had posted online was now evidence in a formal investigation, and military justice moved swiftly when generals took personal interest in cases. Private Ashley Foster found herself summoned to provide testimony about her interactions with Jessica, her consistent respect for the staff sergeant, suddenly relevant in ways she hadn't expected. The young soldier who'd always made room at her table was discovering that simple human decency sometimes mattered more than popular opinion. As evening approached, Carter walked alone toward the supply depot where this transformation had begun. Inside, Jessica continued her inventory work with the same precision she'd maintained through 18 months of institutional failure, unaware that her revelation to the general had triggered changes that would ripple throughout the entire installation. Tomorrow would bring formal recognition, public acknowledgement of excellence that had been hidden for too long, and institutional reform designed to protect future soldiers whose service required classification. But tonight, as Carter approached the depot where truth had finally emerged from shadows, he reflected on lessons about leadership that no military academy had ever taught. Some victories were measured in territories captured or enemies defeated. Others were measured in individual dignity restored and institutional blindness corrected. Both required courage, but Carter was beginning to understand that the second type might be more important for the long term health of the military he'd spent 40 years serving. The supply depot's lights cast warm glow across the desert landscape, and inside its organized storage areas, a soldier who'd served with extraordinary valor in impossible circumstances continued her work with quiet professionalism, finally knowing that recognition was coming. Dawn at Fort Davidson brought unusual activity to the base. By 0600 hours, word had spread through every barracks, mess hall, and duty station that Staff Sergeant Jessica Parker's situation had dramatically changed overnight. Soldiers who'd participated in 18 months of casual cruelty now found themselves facing formal investigations, while those who'd maintained professional respect discovered their integrity being recognized and rewarded. Private Ashley Foster sat in the base legal office, providing testimony that would become crucial evidence in multiple disciplinary proceedings. Her consistent treatment of Jessica with basic human dignity was being documented as an example of proper military conduct, a stark contrast to the behavior exhibited by soldiers now facing court-martial proceedings. Private Foster, Major Williams, the investigating officer, said as she reviewed Foster's statement, "You maintained professional relationships with Staff Sergeant Parker despite prevalent negative opinions about her performance. What influenced your decision?" Foster's answer reflected wisdom beyond her 19 years. "Ma'am, she never treated me with anything but respect and professionalism. Her work was always perfect, her attitude was always positive, and her knowledge was always comprehensive. I couldn't understand why everyone else saw something different." The contrast was becoming clear through dozens of interviews. Soldiers who'd actually worked closely with Jessica recognized her competence and dedication, while those who'd participated in harassment based their opinions on rumors and manufactured narratives rather than direct observation. Meanwhile, in the base commander's office, Colonel Stone was receiving the most difficult briefing of his career. Lieutenant Colonel Cooper had arrived from Washington with declassified portions of Jessica's actual service record, documents that revealed the scope of institutional failure that had occurred under Stone's leadership. Colonel Stone, Cooper, began spreading classified documents across the desk. "I'm authorized to share specific details about Staff Sergeant Parker's background to help you understand the magnitude of what's happened here." The documents painted a picture that made Stone feel physically sick. Jessica's actual achievements included multiple successful missions in hostile territory, advanced tactical training that exceeded most special operations personnel, and commendations from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Her manufactured disciplinary record was a cover story designed to protect classified operations, not an accurate assessment of her capabilities. Operation Nightfall wasn't her only mission, Cooper continued. She participated in 6 classified operations over 3 years, each one preventing situations that could have escalated into international conflicts. Her tactical medicine training has saved lives that can't be publicly acknowledged. Her language skills have provided intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks. Stone stared at the documents, understanding that his failure to protect Jessica represented more than poor leadership. It was a betrayal of someone whose service had literally protected American lives. The woman who'd been organizing supply closets while enduring systematic abuse had capabilities that exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. What are my options here? Stone asked, though he suspected the answer would be professionally devastating. General Carter is recommending your immediate reassignment to a position where your leadership failures won't endanger other classified personnel. Cooper replied without sympathy. This situation represents systematic institutional failure at every level of command. Dr. Ross conducted her final evaluation session with Jessica that afternoon in the base medical facility. The psychological assessment would become part of the official record, documenting how classified service personnel could be failed by the institutions they'd sacrificed to protect. Jessica, Dr. Ross said, using her first name to signal the informal nature of their conversation. How are you processing these rapid changes? Jessica sat quietly for several moments, organizing thoughts that had been suppressed for 18 months. I'm relieved that the truth is finally acknowledged, but I'm also concerned about other veterans facing similar situations at different installations. You're thinking beyond your individual case, Dr. Ross observed. That's consistent with the service mentality that drove your original special operations selection. The harassment I endured was systematic and deliberate, Jessica continued. If it happened here, it's happening elsewhere. Soldiers whose achievements can't be publicly acknowledged become easy targets for people who mistake classification for incompetence. Dr. Ross made notes that would influence policy recommendations extending far beyond Fort Davidson. Jessica's perspective as someone who'd experienced both exceptional military service and systematic institutional failure provided insights that could prevent similar situations throughout the military system. What would you want to see change to protect future veterans in similar situations? Dr. Ross asked. Jessica's answer was comprehensive and strategic. Better integration protocols for personnel transitioning from classified operations. Training for command personnel to recognize signs of manufactured disciplinary records. Protection mechanisms for soldiers whose actual capabilities must remain classified. And accountability for leaders who allow harassment to continue under their command. That evening, General Carter addressed the entire base during an unprecedented formation in the Central Parade Ground. 12,000 soldiers assembled under Nevada stars, unaware they were about to witness a moment that would reshape military culture regarding classified service personnel. Soldiers, Carter began, his voice carrying across the silent formation. We gather tonight to address a failure of leadership, judgment, and basic military values that has occurred at this installation. The crowd stirred uneasily. Mass formations typically announced policy changes or recognized achievements, not institutional failures requiring general officer intervention. For 18 months, this base has allowed systematic harassment of a soldier whose actual service record includes achievements that would humble every person standing in this formation tonight. Staff Sergeant Jessica Parker has endured organized cruelty while carrying secrets that protected American lives and prevented international incidents. Carter paused, letting his words sink in across thousands of soldiers who'd accepted convenient assumptions about Jessica's competence rather than questioning institutional narratives. Sergeant Parker, Carter called, his voice cutting through desert silence. Please step forward. Jessica emerged from the formation with military precision, her movement crisp and confident despite the attention of 12,000 pairs of eyes. She marched to the platform where Carter waited, rendering a salute that he returned with unmistakable respect. Ladies and gentlemen, Carter announced, you are looking at a soldier whose service in classified operations prevented situations that could have escalated into international conflicts. Her tactical skills, medical training, and operational experience exceed those of most personnel at this installation, including many of us in leadership positions. The silence was complete now, thousands of soldiers processing information that contradicted 18 months of accepted base narrative. Jessica stood at attention beside Carter, her bearing reflecting dignity that had survived systematic attempts to destroy it. The harassment that Sergeant Parker has endured represents failure at every level of leadership, Carter continued. Soldiers who participated in organized cruelty towards someone whose actual achievements they couldn't understand. NCOs who allowed unprofessional conduct to continue unchecked. Officers who failed to investigate obvious institutional problems. Lieutenant Lee stood somewhere in the formation, understanding that his failure to protect Jessica would define his military career, regardless of future assignments. Master Sergeant Clark faced similar realization as Carter's words made clear that leadership failures carried permanent consequences. But tonight also represents opportunity, Carter said, his tone shifting from condemnation to challenge. Opportunity to demonstrate that this institution can learn from its failures, protect soldiers who serve in shadows, and maintain standards that honor rather than degrade military service. Carter turned toward Jessica, his next words carrying across the formation with unmistakable sincerity. Staff Sergeant Parker, on behalf of the United States Army and this installation, I formally apologize for the treatment you've received. Your service deserves recognition, your sacrifice deserves acknowledgement, and your dignity deserves protection. The apology hung in the desert air like a benediction, acknowledgement of wrongs that couldn't be undone, but could be learned from. Jessica accepted it with professional grace, her response carrying dignity that 18 months of abuse had been unable to break. Thank you, sir. I'm honored to continue serving in whatever capacity best supports the mission. Carter's smile was genuine as he faced the formation one final time. This base will implement immediate changes to prevent similar failures in the future. We will establish protocols to protect personnel whose service requires classification. We will provide training to recognize and prevent harassment of soldiers under disciplinary review. And we will remember that excellence sometimes hides in shadows, waiting for leaders with wisdom to recognize its presence. As the formation dispersed, Jessica found herself surrounded by soldiers offering apologies, respect, and requests for forgiveness. Private Foster approached with tears in her eyes, proud that her simple human decency had been vindicated by institutional recognition. The transformation was beginning, institutional culture shifting in ways that would protect future veterans whose service couldn't be publicly celebrated. But as Jessica walked back toward her barracks under Nevada stars, she understood that the most important victory wasn't personal vindication. It was proof that truth eventually emerged from shadows when courage and authority aligned to demand. Justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, different responsibilities, and opportunities to help other veterans facing similar institutional blindness. But tonight, for the first time in 18 months, Jessica Parker could walk across Fort Davidson knowing that her service was finally recognized and her dignity finally restored. 3 weeks after General Carter's public revelation, Fort Davidson operated under new protocols that would reshape how the military treated classified service veterans across all installations. The changes weren't just policy adjustments, they represented cultural transformation that acknowledged the unique vulnerabilities faced by soldiers, whose achievements couldn't be publicly celebrated. Jessica stood in her new office within the base's Personnel Security Division, reviewing case files that told familiar stories. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, recently transferred from Fort Bragg, carried service gaps that suggested special operations background, while his official record indicated disciplinary issues. Lieutenant Sarah Chun's training certifications didn't match her current assignment in administrative roles, her competence apparently undermined by a manufactured performance review that protected classified operations. Captain Daniel Reed arrived that morning for his first assignment as Jessica's commanding officer in the newly created Classified Service Integration Unit. Reed's presence at Fort Davidson wasn't coincidental. He'd been Jessica's team leader during Operation Nightfall, the only other Task Force Phantom survivor whose identity could be partially declassified for this specialized assignment. Jessica, Reed said, dropping military formality in the privacy of their secure office. How many cases are we looking at in the initial assessment? 47 personnel across 6 installations, Jessica replied, spreading files across the conference table, each one showing patterns consistent with classified service backgrounds being weaponized by institutional ignorance. The scope was staggering. What had happened to Jessica at Fort Davidson represented systematic failure occurring throughout the military. Wherever soldiers with classified backgrounds were reassigned to conventional units without proper integration. Support, Reed studied the files with growing concern. This goes beyond individual leadership failures. We're looking at institutional blindness that's creating systematic abuse of our most capable personnel. Dr. Ross joined their morning briefing via secure video connection from her Pentagon office, where she was developing psychological support protocols for the program. Her research had expanded to include hundreds of classified service veterans facing varying degrees of institutional isolation and abuse. The psychological patterns are consistent across all cases, Dr. Ross reported. These soldiers are experiencing identity dissociation, institutional betrayal trauma, and social isolation specifically caused by the gap between their actual capabilities and their perceived competence. Jessica reviewed the case file for Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a former drone operator whose classified surveillance work had prevented multiple terrorist attacks. Rodriguez's current assignment involved filing paperwork at Fort Campbell. While enduring constant criticism for supposedly lacking technical skills that actually exceeded those of her supervisors. Maria's situation is particularly disturbing, Jessica noted. She's being treated as technically incompetent while possessing capabilities that are classified above her commanding officer's clearance level. Reed nodded grimly. The irony is brutal. She can't defend herself without violating security protocols. And her superiors can't recognize her expertise because they don't know it exists. The morning briefing continued with case after case of similar institutional failure. Soldiers whose medical training had saved lives in classified operations were being assigned to basic administrative duties. Veterans whose tactical expertise had shaped successful missions were being treated as discipline problems because their decision-making processes seemed inconsistent with their supposed experience levels. Lieutenant Christopher Lee knocked and entered, carrying his new assignment orders. Following the Fort Davidson investigation, Lee had requested transfer to the Classified Service Integration Unit, hoping to make amends for his failure to protect Jessica during her 18 months of abuse. "Ma'am, sir," Lee addressed Jessica and Reed respectively. "I've completed the initial interviews with the Fort Carson cases. Permission to provide briefing on findings?" Jessica nodded, noting how Lee's attitude toward her had completely transformed since learning her actual background. His respect was genuine now, based on understanding rather than obligation, and his commitment to preventing similar institutional failures was driving exceptional performance in his new role. Fort Carson has 11 personnel showing indicators of classified service backgrounds, Lee reported. 7 are facing various forms of harassment or professional marginalization. 4 have been formally reprimanded for performance issues that appear to be manufactured cover stories. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Soldiers whose actual achievements required classification were being systematically failed by institutions that should have protected them. Their cover stories, designed to hide extraordinary capabilities, had become weapons used against them by people who couldn't access the truth. Reed stood and walked to the wall map showing military installations across the United States, each marked with indicators showing numbers of potentially affected personnel. "We're not just fixing individual cases," he said. We're identifying systematic institutional failure that extends throughout the entire military structure. Jessica joined him at the map, understanding the scope of their mission. Every red marker represents soldiers who've sacrificed for classified operations and are now being punished for service they can't discuss. Major Williams arrived for the daily coordination meeting, carrying updates from ongoing investigations at multiple installations. Williams had been promoted to lead the program's investigative division after her thorough work documenting the Fort Davidson situation. The Congressional Armed Services Committee has requested comprehensive briefing on our preliminary findings, Williams announced. Senator Patricia Manning wants detailed analysis of how widespread this problem is across all service branches. The political attention was both encouraging and concerning. Congressional oversight could provide resources and authority needed to implement systematic changes, but it also risked turning classified service veterans into political symbols rather than individuals requiring specialized support. Dr. Ross addressed this concern during her briefing update. We need to maintain focus on individual healing and institutional change rather than allowing political considerations to drive program development. These soldiers need psychological support and professional recognition, not publicity that further complicates their classified backgrounds. Jessica appreciated Ross's perspective. Having spent 18 months as an unwilling example of institutional failure, she understood how quickly individual cases could become political narratives that lost sight of human costs involved. Our primary mission remains unchanged, Jessica said. Identify affected personnel, provide appropriate support, and implement institutional changes that prevent future cases from occurring. Reed pulled up personnel files on his laptop showing progress reports from soldiers who've been identified and provided with appropriate recognition and support. The results are encouraging. Once these veterans receive acknowledgement of their actual capabilities, their performance and psychological well-being improved dramatically. The success stories provided hope that systematic change was possible. Sergeant Rodriguez had been reassigned to advanced technical duties appropriate to her classified training, her competence finally recognized and utilized. Staff Sergeant Mitchell was receiving treatment for combat-related psychological injuries that had been misdiagnosed as disciplinary problems because his trauma came from missions that couldn't be discussed. Private Foster appeared in the office doorway, now serving as administrative support for the integration unit. Her promotion and new assignment recognized her integrity during Jessica's most difficult period, and her enthusiasm for the program's mission was evident in everything she did. "Ma'am," Foster addressed Jessica, "you have a secure communication from Fort Benning. They're requesting immediate consultation on a case that sounds similar to your original situation." Jessica accepted the communication details, already knowing she would travel to Georgia to help another classified service veteran who was facing the same institutional blindness she'd endured. Each successful intervention validated the program's importance and demonstrated that change was possible when leadership committed to protecting rather than exploiting vulnerable soldiers. That afternoon, Jessica stood in the same supply depot where General Carter had first recognized her tattoo 3 weeks earlier. The facility continued operating with the same efficiency she'd established, but now her contributions were acknowledged and celebrated rather than ignored and dismissed. Corporal Turner approached with quarterly inventory reports. Her attitude toward Jessica completely transformed since learning the truth about her background. "Ma'am, the supply efficiency ratings came in from division. We're ranked first in the entire region for accuracy and response times." "Excellent work, Corporal," Jessica replied, recognizing Turner's genuine efforts to improve her performance and make amends for previous indifference. "Your attention to detail has been crucial to maintaining our standards." The conversation represented progress that extended beyond individual relationships. Turner's transformation from indifference to respect demonstrated how institutional culture could change when truth replaced convenient assumptions and leadership prioritized justice over political convenience. As evening approached, Jessica walked across Fort Davidson's parade ground where Carter had delivered his transformative address. The base operated differently now, its personnel educated about recognizing and preventing harassment of soldiers under disciplinary review, its leadership trained to question rather than accept manufactured narratives about competence and character. Tomorrow would bring new cases, fresh challenges, and continued opportunities to help classified service veterans receive recognition and support appropriate to their actual achievements. But tonight, as Jessica reflected on the mission that had emerged from her personal ordeal, she understood that some victories extended far beyond individual vindication. The program she now led would prevent other soldiers from enduring 18 months of systematic abuse while carrying secrets that protected American lives. Each veteran identified and supported validated the principle that service requiring classification deserved protection, not exploitation. Her tattoo remained hidden beneath regulation sleeves, but its meaning had expanded beyond personal recognition to institutional commitment. The geometric patterns that had once marked her as invisible now symbolized systematic change that would protect future generations of soldiers whose service required shadows but whose sacrifice deserved acknowledgement. The mission continued, and Jessica Parker had finally found her true calling in serving those who served in silence. 1 year after General Carter's recognition changed everything. Jessica stood before the Senate Armed Services Committee in a hearing room where classified service veterans would finally receive the institutional protection they deserved. The mahogany-paneled chamber represented the culmination of systematic reform that had begun with a glimpse of black ink beneath a regulation sleeve. Senator Patricia Manning called the hearing to order with words that would reshape military policy for generations. Today we address the Parker Protocol, comprehensive legislation designed to protect personnel whose service requires classification while ensuring their sacrifice receives appropriate recognition and support. The legislation bore Jessica's name, though she'd requested it simply be called the Classified Service Protection Act. Her reluctance to accept public recognition remained consistent with the character that had enabled her to endure 18 months of abuse while protecting secrets that couldn't be discussed. General Carter, now promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, partly due to his leadership during the Fort Davidson transformation, provided opening testimony that established the scope of institutional failure the protocol would address. Senators, our investigation identified 847 personnel across all service branches who were facing various forms of institutional abuse due to classified service backgrounds, Carter reported. These soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines had collectively participated in operations that prevented international conflicts, saved civilian lives, and protected national security interests that cannot be publicly detailed. The numbers were staggering. What had seemed like an isolated problem at Fort Davidson represented systematic failure affecting nearly 1,000 veterans whose actual achievements were hidden beneath manufactured disciplinary records designed to protect classified operations. Dr. Ross, now Director of Psychological Services for Classified Personnel, presented research that documented the human cost of institutional failure. The psychological trauma experienced by these veterans wasn't combat-related PTSD, she explained. It was betrayal trauma caused by institutions that failed to protect people who'd sacrificed everything to protect the institution itself. Jessica's testimony was scheduled for the afternoon session, but she spent the morning observing proceedings from the gallery alongside veterans whose cases had been resolved through the integration unit's work. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez sat nearby now, serving in advanced technical roles appropriate to her classified capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, promoted after his special operations background was properly recognized, had become a leader in developing protocols to protect future classified service veterans. Thought the success stories validated the program's effectiveness. But Jessica understood that legislation was necessary to make protection permanent rather than dependent on individual leadership commitment. Future General Carters might not have the wisdom or authority to recognize institutional failure when it occurred. Captain Reed, now promoted to major and serving as Jessica's deputy in the integration unit, provided operational testimony about program results. In 12 months, we've successfully integrated 623 classified service veterans into appropriate assignments where their capabilities are recognized and utilized, he reported. Performance improvements average 340% when soldiers receive recognition appropriate to their actual training and experience. The transformation wasn't just individual, it was institutional. Military bases across all service branches had implemented training programs designed to recognize signs of classified service backgrounds and prevent harassment of personnel under disciplinary review. The cultural change represented evolution in military thinking about how to protect rather than exploit vulnerable soldiers. Senator David Richardson, ranking minority member, raised concerns about operational security implications of the proposed legislation. General Carter, doesn't this protocol risk compromising classified operations by requiring disclosure of service details? Carter's response reflected months of careful consideration about balancing recognition with security requirements. Senator, the protocol establishes procedures for providing appropriate recognition without compromising operational details. We can acknowledge excellence without revealing the specific operations where that excellence was demonstrated. The solution was elegant. Classified service veterans would receive recognition through secure channels that confirmed their achievements, without exposing operational details to unauthorized personnel. Their commanders would understand their capabilities without learning mission specifics, enabling appropriate assignment and treatment while maintaining essential security protocols. When Jessica was called to testify, the hearing room fell silent. With respectful attention, her transformation from supply depot clerk enduring systematic abuse to program director protecting classified service veterans nationwide represented a journey that embodied American military values at their finest. Senators, Jessica began, I appear before you not seeking personal recognition, but advocating for institutional change that protects soldiers who serve in shadows to defend our nation's most vital interests. Her testimony was comprehensive, but focused, describing the psychological impact of institutional abandonment, while emphasizing solutions rather than dwelling on past failures. Jessica had learned that effective advocacy required forward-looking vision rather than backward-looking grievance. The soldiers I now serve through the integration unit represent capabilities that extend far beyond conventional military training. She continued, they've prevented international conflicts through diplomatic protection operations, saved civilian lives through humanitarian rescue missions, and gathered intelligence that prevented terrorist attacks against American citizens. Jessica paused, choosing her words carefully to honor classified service without violating security protocols. These achievements cannot be publicly celebrated, but they can be institutionally acknowledged through procedures that protect both operational security and individual dignity. Senator Manning leaned forward with obvious interest. Staff Sergeant Parker, what specific protections would you recommend for future veterans in similar situations? Jessica's response drew from her comprehensive experience working with classified service veterans across multiple installations. First, mandatory training for all command personnel to recognize indicators of classified service backgrounds. Second, protection protocols preventing harassment of soldiers whose actual capabilities may be classified. Third, psychological support services specifically designed for veterans whose trauma comes from service that cannot be discussed. The recommendations represented systematic thinking about institutional reform that would prevent future Jessica Parker's from enduring months of abuse while carrying secrets that protected American lives. Each proposal was practical, implementable, and designed to function within existing military structures. At Dr. Ross provided supporting testimony about the psychological research underlying Jessica's recommendations. Traditional military medicine isn't equipped to treat trauma that comes from institutional betrayal rather than combat experience, she explained. We need specialized protocols for veterans whose injuries were inflicted by the very institutions they sacrificed to protect. As the hearing concluded, Senator Manning announced the committee's unanimous support for the Parker Protocol legislation. This Congress will ensure that no future veteran faces the institutional abandonment that Staff Sergeant Parker endured while protecting our nation's most sensitive operations. That evening, Jessica stood on the Lincoln Memorial steps with veterans from across the classified service community who'd traveled to Washington for the hearing. The marble monument represented ideals of service and sacrifice that resonated deeply with soldiers whose own service required similar dedication to principles larger than individual recognition. Captain Reed joined her as they looked across the reflecting pool toward the Capitol building, where legislation bearing her name would soon become law. Jessica, you've transformed personal trauma into institutional protection for thousands of future veterans. That's strategic thinking at the highest level. Jessica smiled, but her thoughts remained focused on the veterans who would benefit from reforms rather than the recognition she was receiving. The real victory isn't legislation, it's cultural change that makes this kind of institutional failure impossible in the future. Private Foster, now Sergeant Foster, and serving as Jessica's senior administrative specialist, approached with updates from integration unit operations continuing despite their Washington travel. Ma'am, we received 17 new case referrals today. Fort Hood has identified 6 personnel showing classic indicators, and Naval Special Warfare Command wants consultation on integration protocols for retiring SEALs. The work continued, growing in scope and sophistication as military culture evolved to protect rather than exploit soldiers whose service required classification. Each successful intervention validated the principle that excellence deserved recognition, regardless of whether that excellence could be publicly celebrated. Later that night, Jessica sat alone in her hotel room, reviewing files from veterans whose cases would be her focus in coming months. Each folder represented someone facing the same institutional blindness she'd endured, someone whose actual capabilities were being dismissed because their true service couldn't be acknowledged. Her secure phone buzzed with a message from General Carter, now dealing with similar cases at the highest levels of military leadership. Jessica, the culture change you've initiated extends beyond individual cases. Military leadership worldwide is implementing protocols based on your work. The impact is immeasurable. Jessica typed her response carefully, choosing words that reflected her continuing commitment to service over recognition. Sir, the mission continues. Every veteran we help validates the principle that service in shadows deserves protection, not exploitation. She closed the phone and walked to the hotel window overlooking Washington, D.C., where monuments honored military service that could be publicly celebrated, while legislation now existed to protect service that had to remain hidden. The geometric patterns of her tattoo remained concealed beneath regulation sleeves, but their meaning had expanded far beyond personal identification to institutional commitment. Tomorrow would bring new cases, fresh challenges, and continued opportunities to help classified service veterans receive recognition appropriate to their sacrifice. The Parker Protocol would provide legal framework for protection, but cultural change required ongoing commitment from leaders at every level. Jessica understood that her true legacy wouldn't be legislation or recognition. It would be measured in nightmares prevented, careers protected, and dignity preserved for soldiers who served in shadows, where medals couldn't be awarded, but honor could still be maintained. The general who had once ignored her Salute had inadvertently triggered transformation that would protect thousands of future veterans whose service required classification, but whose sacrifice deserved acknowledgement. Some victories were measured in territories captured or enemies defeated. Others were measured in institutional wisdom gained and systematic failures corrected. Both required courage, but Jessica had learned that the second type might be more important for the long-term health of the military she'd spent her career serving, first in operations that officially never happened, and now in reforms that would ensure such operations never again became sources of institutional abuse. The shadows where she'd learned to serve had taught her that some missions required darkness, but justice demanded light. Finding balance between those requirements had become her calling, and the work would continue as long as soldiers served in silence, to protect the freedom of those who would never know their names. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.